Picture this for a second. A single king stands at the center of ancient history. To some people, he's a monster. To others, he's a visionary genius. And to one of the world's major religions, he's the man who shattered their universe. This is the story of Nebuchadnezzar II. He's the king who burned Jerusalem to the ground, destroyed the first temple, and dragged an entire people into exile. But here's the twist, and this is where things get uncomfortable. That same man rebuilt Babylon into the most magnificent city on earth. A city so legendary that later generations would whisper about walls no army could breach, and gardens so beautiful they were counted among the 7 wonders of the ancient world. Now here's the open question I want you to hold on to, because we'll come back to it later. How does one man become both a biblical villain and history's greatest city builder? And there's something even stranger we'll uncover near the end of this video. A moment when this all-powerful king may have believed the gods themselves had turned against him. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Before Nebuchadnezzar became a symbol of divine punishment, before Jerusalem fell, before Babylon became the envy of the ancient world, he was just a prince standing at the edge of history, about to inherit an empire that demanded conquest, destruction, and glory. In this documentary, we're going to walk through his rise, his wars, his most infamous decision, and the legacy that still echoes through religion, archaeology, and storytelling today. This is Ancient Odyssey, and if you haven't already, subscribe, because stories like this are exactly why this channel exists. Now, let's go back to Babylon, before it ruled the world. Before Babylon became the city of legends, it was something far more dangerous. It was ambitious. Babylon sat in modern-day Iraq, along the Euphrates River, a perfect location for trade, farming, and power. For centuries, it had been important, but never dominant. It lived in the shadow of bigger, scarier empires, especially Assyria, the ancient world's undisputed king of brutality. Assyria didn't just conquer cities. It terrified them into submission. Babylon had been conquered, humiliated, and rebuilt more times than it liked to admit. Sometimes it rebelled. Sometimes it survived by bowing its head. But one thing never changed. Babylon believed it was destined for greatness. And then, the unthinkable happened. The Assyrian Empire, the most feared military machine on earth, began to collapse. Civil wars broke out. Enemies closed in. And Babylon, long treated like a troublesome subordinate, finally saw its chance. Enter Nabopolassar, Nebuchadnezzar's father. He wasn't born into unquestioned power. He took it. Around 626 BCE, Nabopolassar led a rebellion that broke Babylon free from Assyrian control. And with the help of new allies, most importantly the Medes, he helped destroy Assyria's great cities, including the infamous capital, Nineveh. This wasn't just revenge. It was a power vacuum. Suddenly, Babylon wasn't just free. It was rising fast, sitting on the ruins of the old world order. But freedom brought a terrifying question. Could Babylon actually hold an empire together? Because as Assyria fell, 2 massive forces moved to claim its territory. Egypt pushing north, Babylon pushing west. And caught between them were smaller kingdoms, places like Judah, with Jerusalem at its heart, trying desperately to survive in the middle of 2 superpowers. This is the world Nebuchadnezzar was born into. A world where empires didn't just expand, they collided. A world where kings were forged by war. And a world where hesitation meant extinction. Babylon was finally strong enough to dream big. But it still needed a leader ruthless enough to make that dream real. And that leader was coming. His name was Nebuchadnezzar II. Nebuchadnezzar didn't grow up expecting a quiet life. From the very beginning, his world revolved around war rooms, not classrooms. Around marching armies, not peaceful ceremonies. He was the eldest son of Nabopolassar, the rebel-turned-king who had ripped Babylon out from under Assyrian control. And that meant one thing. Nebuchadnezzar wasn't being raised to rule, he was being trained to survive. Babylon's empire was still young, fragile, surrounded by enemies who would love nothing more than to see it collapse. So Nebuchadnezzar learned fast. He learned how to command troops, how to move armies across rivers and deserts, how to crush resistance before it turned into rebellion. And then came his proving ground. In 605 BCE, the fate of the Near East came down to one explosive confrontation. Babylon versus Egypt at the city of Carchemish. Egypt believed it could replace Assyria as the dominant power in the region. Babylon disagreed. Nebuchadnezzar, still a crown prince, led the Babylonian forces. And what followed wasn't a close call. It was a decisive annihilation. Egyptian forces were smashed so completely that they never again seriously challenged Babylonian control of the region. Overnight, Nebuchadnezzar went from prince to military legend. But history didn't even give him time to celebrate. Shortly after the victory at Carchemish, word arrived. Nabopolassar was dead. Nebuchadnezzar did something remarkable and dangerous. Instead of staying with the army to secure more victories, he raced back across hundreds of miles of hostile territory to Babylon. Because in the ancient world, an empty throne didn't stay empty for long. He arrived just in time. Nebuchadnezzar was crowned king in 605 BCE. Young, battle-tested, and ruling an empire that expected constant expansion. From day one, his message was clear. Babylon would not inherit Assyria's empire quietly. It would enforce it. This was not a philosopher king. This was a commander wearing a crown. And now that Nebuchadnezzar held absolute power, the smaller kingdoms along Babylon's western frontier, Judah included, were about to learn what Babylonian rule really meant. With the crown barely settled on his head, Nebuchadnezzar didn't slow down. He couldn't. Babylon's empire wasn't held together by tradition or loyalty. It was held together by fear, momentum, and victory. And if Nebuchadnezzar stopped expanding, the entire structure could crack. To the north and east, Assyria was finished, its cities burned, its power broken. But to the south and west, Egypt was still watching, still waiting for Babylon to slip. So Nebuchadnezzar went on the offensive. Year after year, Babylonian armies marched west into Syria and the Levant. City after city fell, not always after long sieges, but often because resistance had become pointless. Babylon's reputation traveled faster than its soldiers. And Egypt? Egypt tried to push back. Pharaoh Necho II had once controlled much of the region, but after Carchemish, Egyptian forces found themselves constantly harassed, driven south, and beaten back toward the Sinai. Nebuchadnezzar didn't need to conquer Egypt itself, he just needed to neutralize it. And he succeeded. By the early years of his reign, Babylon stood unchallenged as the dominant power from Mesopotamia to the Mediterranean coast. Smaller kingdoms now faced an impossible choice: submit and pay tribute, or resist and be erased. One of those kingdoms was Judah. Judah sat in a nightmare position, right between Babylon and Egypt. Its kings tried to play both sides, switching loyalties depending on who seemed stronger at the moment. Nebuchadnezzar saw that not as diplomacy, but as betrayal. To him, loyalty wasn't flexible. It was absolute. This was the mindset that shaped his rule. Nebuchadnezzar believed the gods, especially Marduk, Babylon's chief deity, had granted him authority over the world. Rebellion wasn't just political treason, it was a cosmic insult. And when kingdoms rebelled, Nebuchadnezzar responded the way emperors did in the ancient world. Not with negotiation, but with siege engines. The stage was now set. Babylon had crushed the old empires. Egypt had been pushed aside. And Judah, small, defiant, and dangerously hopeful, stood directly in Nebuchadnezzar's path. What came next would echo through history, scripture, and memory for thousands of years. By now, Nebuchadnezzar had proven something critical. Babylon was unstoppable. But raw power isn't enough. Sometimes, a king needs to send a message. And in the ancient world, there's no better message than war. That's where Judah and its capital, Jerusalem, come in. Judah wasn't a massive empire. In fact, compared to Babylon, it was tiny, a speck on the map. But its location was strategic, right along the trade routes from Egypt to Mesopotamia. And most importantly, its kings had been flip-flopping between loyalties. One year pledging allegiance to Babylon, the next whispering with Egypt. For Nebuchadnezzar, that was more than a minor annoyance. It was an insult to Marduk and a challenge to his authority. So he acted. In 597 BCE, Babylonian armies first appeared outside Jerusalem's walls. The city had some defenses, such as solid walls and strong gates, but it was nothing compared to the might of Babylon's military machine, which now included thousands of troops, siege towers, and battering rams. King Jehoiakim of Judah attempted diplomacy, hoping to avoid destruction. He sent tribute, but it wasn't enough. Babylon had a plan: subjugation or obliteration. There was no middle ground. The first siege ended with Jerusalem forced to surrender. The king died, or in some accounts was executed, and thousands of Jews were deported to Babylon. Among them, craftsmen, soldiers, and elite members of society. This would later be remembered as the First Babylonian Exile. But Nebuchadnezzar wasn't finished. He needed to ensure Jerusalem could never rise against Babylon again. And the city still harbored resistance, whispers of rebellion and stubborn loyalty to its own kings. So he waited, and he struck again. The stage was set for what would become the most infamous siege in his reign, an event that would be immortalized in history, scripture, and legend. And it was about to change everything for Judah. This is the part of Nebuchadnezzar's story that people remember. And for good reason. Jerusalem, a city sacred to its people, was about to face total annihilation. The second siege began around 589 BCE, and it lasted for months. Babylonian armies surrounded the city, cutting off food, water, and escape routes. Inside the walls, the population suffered. Famine, disease, and fear spread like wildfire. Families clung to hope, but hope was running out. Nebuchadnezzar didn't just want to defeat the city. He wanted to send a message. The siege was as psychological as it was military. Any thoughts of rebellion had to be crushed completely. When Jerusalem finally fell in 587 BCE, the destruction was total. The first temple, built by Solomon and the heart of Jewish worship, was burned to the ground. Palaces, homes, and city walls were demolished. Thousands more people were deported to Babylon, forced to leave their homeland and start life in exile. To the Babylonians, it was a strategic victory. To the people of Judah, it was a trauma that would echo for generations. And here's where history gets cinematic. Nebuchadnezzar, the same man who could raise walls and gardens to rival the heavens, now stood as the ultimate destroyer. Yet, in his own eyes, he was a servant of the gods, executing divine justice. This duality, destroyer of Jerusalem, builder of Babylon, is what makes Nebuchadnezzar so compelling. He wasn't just a king, he was a force of nature, both terrifying and awe-inspiring. And while Jerusalem smoldered, Babylon itself was preparing for something incredible. Because Nebuchadnezzar wasn't done leaving his mark on the world. He had plans that would make his name immortal, not just as a conqueror, but as a visionary builder. With Jerusalem destroyed and his empire secure, Nebuchadnezzar turned to a different kind of conquest, architecture. Babylon wasn't just a city anymore. It was about to become a statement to the world. Every wall, gate, and temple wasn't just functional. It was a message. Babylon is eternal. Its king is chosen by the gods. And resistance is futile. Let's start with the walls. You've probably heard of them. They were massive, stretching tens of miles, with towers so high you could see the Euphrates River from their top. These walls weren't just for defense. They were propaganda in stone, meant to awe visitors and intimidate enemies. Then came the temples. Nebuchadnezzar poured resources into restoring and expanding Babylon's religious centers, especially the Assyria, dedicated to Marduk, Babylon's chief god. Lavish decorations, towering ziggurats, and golden accents. He made sure that anyone entering the city would feel the presence of divine power. And of course, there were the legendary gates. The Ishtar Gate, with its vivid blue bricks and depictions of dragons and bulls, became the symbol of Babylon itself. Walking through it was like stepping into a city where gods, kings, and mortals intersected. Some historians argue that these projects weren't just about glory. They were strategic. Babylon had survived repeated invasions in the past. Massive walls and monumental architecture served a dual purpose: military defense and psychological dominance. Anyone approaching the city would know instantly, this is no ordinary place. This is Babylon, the crown jewel of the ancient world. And while some gates and temples still inspire awe today, there's one project that has captured imagination for millennia: the Hanging Gardens of Babylon. Were they real? Or just a legend born from the imagination of later writers? We'll explore that next, but whatever the truth, Babylon under Nebuchadnezzar was a city no one would forget. If you ask most people what Nebuchadnezzar II is best known for, after Jerusalem, the answer is usually immediate: the Hanging Gardens of Babylon. Terraced gardens rising above the city. Exotic plants cascading down stone platforms. Water flowing uphill in a desert landscape, defying nature itself. Ancient writers described it as paradise built by human hands. According to later Greek accounts, Nebuchadnezzar supposedly constructed the gardens for his wife, Amytas, who missed the green mountains of her homeland. It's a beautiful story. There's just one problem. We've never found them. No Babylonian inscriptions, none written by Nebuchadnezzar himself, mention the Hanging Gardens. And this is important because Nebuchadnezzar loved bragging about his building projects. If he had built one of the greatest wonders in human history, You'd expect him to say so. So what's going on? One possibility is that the gardens did exist, but later writers exaggerated them. Greek historians like Strabo and Diodorus Siculus were writing centuries later, relying on second-hand accounts. Over time, engineering feats can turn into legends. Another theory is even more intriguing. Some scholars believe the Hanging Gardens weren't in Babylon at all, but in Nineveh, built by the Assyrian king Sennacherib decades earlier. He did write about massive gardens, advanced irrigation systems, and water-lifting technology. Over time, the stories may have been misattributed to the more famous Babylon. So did Nebuchadnezzar build the Hanging Gardens? The honest answer is, we don't know. What we do know is that Babylon under Nebuchadnezzar was breathtaking, with lush gardens, grand processional ways, and temples gleaming with color and gold. Even without the Hanging Gardens, the city easily qualified as one of the ancient world's greatest marvels. And in a way, that uncertainty only adds to Nebuchadnezzar's mystique. Because when history blurs into legend, you know you're dealing with a ruler whose impact was truly enormous. But while Babylon flourished outwardly, cracks may have been forming within the king himself. Cracks that ancient writers would later describe as madness, divine punishment, or something far more human. By the later years of his reign, Nebuchadnezzar had everything an ancient king could possibly want. Absolute power, a secure empire, and a capital city that looked like it had been built to impress the gods themselves. And yet, this is when the ancient sources start to get unsettling. In the biblical book of Daniel, Nebuchadnezzar appears not just as a conqueror, but as a man humbled, struck by divine punishment for his pride. The text describes a dramatic episode where the king loses his sanity, lives like an animal, and only regains his throne after acknowledging the supremacy of God. Now, let's be clear, Babylonian records do not describe this event the same way. There's no official inscription saying, "By the way, I went mad for 7 years." Kings didn't write things like that. But the story raises a serious question historians still debate. Was something actually wrong with Nebuchadnezzar near the end of his life? Some scholars suggest the biblical account may reflect a real episode, later framed through religious storytelling. Others think it's symbolic, a moral lesson about pride and power. And then there's a third option. The story preserves a memory of a temporary illness, breakdown, or withdrawal from public life, exaggerated over time. What's interesting is that Nebuchadnezzar's building inscriptions slow down toward the end of his reign. His presence in the historical record becomes quieter. Not gone, but less dominant. In a world where kings were expected to be publicly visible, endlessly victorious, and eternally confident, silence is suspicious. Whether madness, illness, or legend, this chapter of Nebuchadnezzar's life forces us to confront a deeply human truth. Even the most powerful rulers are not immune to fear, doubt, or decline. The man who crushed cities and raised wonders may have ended his life grappling not with armies, but with his own mind, his gods, and his legacy. And soon, that legacy would face its greatest test. Because Nebuchadnezzar's death wouldn't just end a reign, it would begin the slow unraveling of an empire he worked so hard to build. Nebuchadnezzar II died around 562 BCE, after ruling Babylon for more than 4 decades. By ancient standards, that alone was extraordinary. He left behind an empire that stretched across the Near East, a capital city unmatched in beauty, and a reputation that made neighboring kingdoms think twice before rebelling. But here's the uncomfortable truth about empires built around one towering personality. When the titan falls, the cracks start to show. Nebuchadnezzar's successors simply weren't him. His son, Marduk, ruled for just 2 years before being assassinated. After that came a rapid shuffle of kings, short reigns, palace intrigue, and internal instability. The throne changed hands quickly, and authority began to feel uncertain. The walls were still massive. The temples still stood. But the confidence was gone. Babylon no longer projected inevitability. It projected vulnerability. Meanwhile, far to the east, a new power was rising quietly and patiently. The Persians, led by a man history would remember as Cyrus the Great. Unlike Nebuchadnezzar, Cyrus didn't rely purely on terror. He used tolerance, propaganda, and calculated mercy. And Babylon, once the destroyer of empires, was unprepared for this new style of conquest. In 539 BCE, less than a generation after Nebuchadnezzar's death, Babylon fell to Persia with surprisingly little resistance. The city that once seemed eternal changed hands almost peacefully. The irony is impossible to miss. Nebuchadnezzar built Babylon to last forever. But without him, it couldn't even last 30 years. His empire collapsed. His city endured, but under someone else's rule. And his legacy? That was just beginning. So how should we remember Nebuchadnezzar II? As the king who burned Jerusalem and shattered a people's world? Or as the visionary ruler who turned Babylon into the most magnificent city of its age? The uncomfortable answer is both. Nebuchadnezzar didn't see a contradiction. In the ancient world, destruction and creation were two sides of the same coin. You destroyed resistance, so you could build permanence. You crushed cities, so your own would never fall. To Babylon, he was the perfect king. To Judah, he was a catastrophe. To history, he's a reminder that greatness often comes at a terrifying cost. His story forces us to wrestle with questions that still matter today. Can monumental achievement justify immense suffering? Is power admirable when it's effective, or only when it's humane? And who gets to decide which legacy survives? Because Nebuchadnezzar didn't just reshape cities, he reshaped memory. His actions gave rise to exile, scripture, prophecy, and some of the most enduring stories ever told. Even now, thousands of years later, we're still debating him. That might be his greatest legacy of all. He built wonders that vanished. He destroyed a city that would rise again. But the questions his life raises? Those never went away. This has been Ancient Odyssey. If you enjoyed this deep dive into one of history's most complex rulers, subscribe for more cinematic stories from the ancient world, where heroes aren't always heroes and villains aren't always simple.